Give it another minute. Thank you everyone for your patience. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. For those of you who just joined us, I'll kind of reiterate a few things. But first, I want to start with some introductions of staff. Julie, want to go to the next slide? My name is Andrew Tran. I work with the Office of Planning and Community Development. We're housed at the City of Seattle. And I'm here with my colleague Julia Pasciuto and Margot, who is supporting this equitable transit-oriented development work. And as I already mentioned, if you all can type your name, organization, or community that you're affiliated with, and your email into the chat. Also, we will be recording this webinar. You're welcome to be on camera if you'd like. If you don't like to be recorded, please feel free to have your camera off. And also, if you are participating, if you can have your mic turned off until we get to the question and answer section at the end of the presentation. We'd like to...
sorry, Andrew, where's the chat?
The chat, thank you, Betty. If you have questions and things that you'd like to enter in as we are going along, you can access the chat at the bottom right of the screen. It's a little speech bubble. It says chat that is right next to an icon that says participants.
Oh.
Do you see it now, Betty?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Wasn't where I expected it to be.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're very grateful for the opportunity to be able to share this work with you all and the opportunity. We're going to start with some context around why we're even doing this work as a city in partnership with community members. Then we'll go into specifically more details around the community advisory group, folks that we're looking for, the expertise that we're looking for, and then we will share some information on the timeline of the body of work. And then we want to reserve most of the time for you all to ask questions and have a discussion with us. Next slide.
We're here today, and I'm here to acknowledge the stewards of the Coast Salish land, original and current caretakers, the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot tribes. On behalf of the Office of Planning and Community Development, we'd like to actively recognize that we're on indigenous land, traditional and current territories of the Coast Salish people. As part of our ongoing commitment to our land acknowledgement through this process, we're closely working with urban native organizations to actively recruit for the community advisory group and leaning on indigenous methodologies and values of informed consent, transparency, and self-determination. As Andrew mentioned, we just want to do a little bit of context setting that they're, recognizing that there's been a legacy of harm in development and planning process, starting from the, the colonization and the Point Elliott Treaty and genocide of Indigenous people, from highway construction and urban renewal to redlining and racially restrictive covenants, that we are now witnessing a pattern of investments in infrastructure like transportation being followed by increased displacement pressures. And that through this process, we're trying to be proactive and change the narrative for community-led and stewarded development. OPCD is co-developed with a community steering group. Some of the work that we're going to walk through moving forward in this presentation, but we just wanted to give you some sense of what it is that we're talking about and what are the outcomes that we might be looking for through this process.
Thank you, Julia. So before we go into the specifics of the community advisory group, we wanted to talk to you all about why we're even doing this body of work. So obviously, Julia talked about kind of the historical impetus for why we're doing it, but we also, in the last few years, have received funding from the Federal Transit Administration to support equitable development outcomes and equitable transit-oriented development outcomes as it relates to the transit investments that are coming into our city, including the new light rail stations. And it's also an opportunity for the city and our department to do planning differently, starting with the opportunity for us to center community priorities. How do we create a process where community get to define the outcomes and not the city? And how can community tell us how we do our work to address the institutional harm that was mentioned in the previous slide? We also want to create a process where development the outcomes can support development that are led by communities of color, particularly traditionally marginalized communities and communities that are at the highest risk of displacement. This body of work is also going to allow us to support community self-determination and avenues for supporting community ownership, ownership and stewardship of land. It also is fairly process driven in terms of the values we want to center, and it will allow us to recognize that there's been historical exclusion from decision making and planning processes that have resulted in negative impacts for communities of color. And as you see on this slide, when you talk about what equitable transit-oriented development is, there's a lot of times different perceptions depending on who you ask and what city you're in. In Seattle, we've done some work with community members so far, a smaller group of community members to really help us create kind of a starting place for what we mean when we say equitable transit-oriented development. What you see on the screen is not by no means set in stone. It's just for us to be able to have a conversation with community and being able to center community priorities that that I mentioned in the previous slide. So some of the things that equitable transit-oriented development can actually address and some of the outcomes that it could result to is land ownership. We can have conversations about zoning and density, but how does that actually support community actually owning land and having a tool to address displacement? And we've also talked to folks who really believe in what access and mobility justice means, like not just being able to use the transit system, but how can the transit system relate to and also expand access to other things like services that people might need to get to, and then also can they even access that service through affordability and design of spaces. Equitable transit-oriented development can also help build and support community power. It could really provide a process where community ownership of land and stewardship of land are conversations and that are being led by community themselves who are impacted by the investments. We also want to develop a body of work that allows us to the investments that we're putting in really lead to supporting community benefits. So not just like transit investments that get people from point A to point B, but how can those investments also satisfy other things that community need, like childcare, cultural spaces, um, food access, open and green space. We also know that with transit investments, it gives us the opportunity to address the environment. We're in a state of our environment where it's very critical to think about how different modes of travel and how we develop our communities can really support a healthy environment. And then also economic justice. How can these investments also help communities build wealth and commercial ownership? And before I go into this slide, I want to say that in the previous slide, these are elements that as community advisory group members, you all and whoever will become part of the advisory group will have the opportunity to actually shape these elements and refine it. So it's not us saying this is what it has to be. It's just this is what we've heard so far from our work in community, and this is where we are starting from.
Great, thank you for that background on ETOD. So the Community Advisory Group is really about creating this strategy and implementation plan for how Seattle can actually practice what we have just talked about with ETOD. So it's really about community-led and owned development. So that's why we want folks from the community who will be leading this work. And we're really focusing on high risk of displacement areas around new light rail stations. So along the West Yallard link extension and the Ballard link extension. And this plan that we create can be very holistic, just like the examples that Andrew just gave. It's not only about affordable housing, it could be about childcare, grocery stores, gathering spaces, art, sense of belonging, pretty comprehensive. And economic development as well was another one that he mentioned. From a logistics side, the group will meet about twice a month for 1.5 years. The first year we'll be creating this strategy implementation plan, and then after that it will meet less frequently just to help us advise as we try to put the plan into action. Each meeting will be up to 2 hours, and most of them will be virtual, so online over the computer. The ones in the beginning will be in person so we can get to know each other. And the meeting time will be decided on by the group so that we can make sure everyone can be present. This is a compensated position, so it's $75 an hour. We want to, make sure that people's time and energy and contributions are being appreciated and valued in that way and to make it more accessible for everyone. And we will have a facilitator that we are hiring from outside of the city. So there will be a third party person to help facilitate the group as well. And then a bit about who we're looking for. I think that context that Julia gave about the history, this group is really about trying to include and have the communities that have historically been harmed or left out of development in the planning process, have those be the communities that are leading it this time around, to really try to shift that narrative around who gets to make these decisions and what our spaces look like. So specifically, that's Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, immigrants and refugees. We're looking for youth. They have to be 18 plus in order for us to compensate them. Elders, people with disabilities, LGBTQ, two-spirit, and other identities, and especially people with intersecting identities or multiple community ties. And in total, we're looking for about 10 to 20 people from a range of all of these communities. And then for desired experience, we view this as a leadership development opportunity. So doesn't need to be an executive director of a nonprofit. We'd love to have new voices, make sure we're hearing from new folks who aren't as often heard by the city, and giving an opportunity for emerging leaders to develop as well. Really looking for people who have some kind of policy advocacy or community organizing experience and strong ties to a community. So we are asking for a reference letter of support. It's very short, only 3 to 4 sentences, but just hoping to make sure that someone in a community can vouch for this person as being really actively involved. And that can be someone from a community-based organization that you're affiliated with, whether that's a nonprofit or a religious institution, or it could be less formal, like a mutual aid group or just a community advisory group. It doesn't have to be an official legal entity, but some kind of community tie. An extra bonus if you have worked on community development or other design projects before. And then we also really want to value lived experience as well. So if you've experienced being displaced, you don't have to live in Seattle. We want people with ties to Seattle. So that could be you live there and have been displaced, or you work there, or you attend religious services here, or you have community, family, friends that you visit regularly in Seattle. Looking as well for tenants or renters, low-wage workers, people who are dependent on transit to get around, small business owners as well. So trying to get a broad range of experiences.
Thank you, Margot. I want to spend some time before we get into talking a little bit about what you'll get from this process, and before we open it up to Q&A. I'll walk us through the major components of this work. So you'll see there's about 5 main components of this body of work, starting with the healing and trust building component. And this is really, again, I want to reiterate that this process actually was developed by a smaller group of community members. So we're starting off by what we're hearing is important to people in terms of process. And this first component is really about making sure we're giving space to honor the lived experience that people have gone through. If you have been displaced, we want to make sure that everyone who is participating can start on the same foundational understanding of what displacement is and how it has impacted how we make public investments. It's also an opportunity to build trust between the advisory group members and that we have a shared understanding of institutional racism. The next body of work you'll see is refining the foundational work. So some of the things that we've already shared with you is the elements of equitable transit-oriented development. We also want to refine what we mean when we say that, the vision of what ETOD is, and then also process values. So like the values that we want to exhibit together and be accountable to as we're going throughout the process. By quarter 4 of 2024, we'll get into establishing work groups and the ETOD tactics. So what we mean by that is while you all be meeting mostly together as a whole group, once we get into establishing some of these ETOD tactics, we want to split up into small groups so that we can advance what the tactics are in more detail, and so that we can have more pointed conversation in smaller groups. So some examples of what ETOD tactics can be is an example is like, how can publicly owned land support eco-transit-oriented development outcomes, and how can publicly owned land support community benefits and priorities in communities? Another example can be, how can this work support building community leadership, and how can it support stewarding development and land in station areas? After that core work program, we'll get into what we call like the implementation phases, and there's 2 major components there. There's the development of the actual implementations plan itself. So that's going to spell out, in addition to the tactics, it's what do we need to get those tactics actually working for communities? What are the funding sources? Who needs to be involved? Who's leading it? What city mechanisms are already in place? And how can we make that as part of the city's work plan, and then what are the things that community need in order to make those things happen. And then the last part of the implementation is really around finalizing this plan. And the plan can mean anything. It doesn't have to be what you think of as like a typical like city plan or strategy. But it's really about having. We'll meet less frequently by the time this comes in the second and third quarter of 2025, but making sure that we're always checking back in with this group as the city is refining and finalizing the plan to make sure that we're getting everything right. The last part of this is starting, like once we have this plan developed, it'll transition into the city and also working with communities ongoing. And that could be anywhere from now, like 2025, to even when some of these transit investments are built and after they're built. And I will end with talking a little bit about what you'll get out of this process. So because we really valuable the time of community members and we value your lived experience, we want to make sure that this process isn't extractive. And what I mean by that is we're not just having you come and give us information, but we want to create this process with the understanding that we're building our leadership as well as your leadership together in advancing equitable outcomes in communities. It will give you an opportunity to learn about historical institutional racism, how that has affected how the city's done their work, and how that has affected communities' ability to thrive. We also will talk about, it's an opportunity for you to explore strategies for creating systemic change. You'll also be able to work with the city and other departments, but closely with our department, Office Planning Community Development, on this planning process, and you'll be able to build relationships with us and with each other. And with that, let's go to, if you all are interested, the deadline for applying to the community advisory group is October 15th. And then also if you have anyone in mind that you think would be a good fit or interested in this opportunity, please do forward this on to them. And with that, we'll transition into question and answers.
I was just going to briefly add, the application itself is done through Submittable, but if you go to our website and click on the Apply tab, you'll get the link to that, and we have an application guide that's uploaded there as well, where you can preview the questions and look at our selection rubric to understand more of the criteria of who we're looking for. Questions?
Also feel free to enter into the chat if that is, that works better for you. If you have questions, feel free to go off mute, or I think Dalton, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, I had one quick question, if I can pop in, sorry. I was wondering, so I passed the opportunity over to like a couple different people that I had in mind, and they were wondering whether there's any stipulations on like if you are already like in a position with like city or county or state, or I don't know, like if you're not allowed to be on the advisory group, if you have a professional position at the public level.
Do you want me to jump in on that one?
Please do.
So we don't have any restrictions on participation. I think where there's strong alignment in your body of work, like if you work for King County Metro or Sound Transit or Seattle Department of Transportation and you're actively working on ST3, we might engage you in a different way. Like if you're working on equitable transit oriented development or transit projects directly tied to this work, we would ask to work with you in a different capacity. But if you're a public employee, the only restriction is that you would need to get authorization from your employer and potentially the ethics office about receiving compensation. We traditionally don't fund other public employees who are participating like while being paid by a public agency. But if you're participating on your own time, we would be able to compensate you. So I think that's the only distinction that we're making right now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
I think I saw your hand up first, and then we can go to, oh, go ahead, Betty.
Okay, so is the PowerPoint going to be made available later?
The PowerPoint will be as a PDF, and we will also make this recording available on our website. So please go to the website. Margot, do you mind entering the website link into the chat for folks?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that was my next question. Is that the OPCD website or,
It's nested within OPC website.
okay,
Thank you.
thank
I think
you.
the next hand is, please let me know how you pronounce your name. Sega?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, great.
Can you please repeat the commitment? I think I'm on.
Is your question about what the time commitment will be, Sega?
Yes.
Andrew or Margot, do you want to speak?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Margot.
The group will start meeting in January. So applications due October 15th. We'll get back to folks by the end of November. And then with the holidays and all, we're just going to start after the new year. And then it's about a year and a half. The first year, it'll meet twice a month for up to 2 hours each meeting. And then for that next half year will be more as needed as to advise us on actually implementing this to make sure that we're, in line with what the community actually wants.
And if I can add a little bit of clarification, at the beginning of the process, likely in the healing and trust building part of the process, the advisory group will be able to determine like if something we did and the smaller steering group is that folks said, July is a very busy month for folks in terms of like summer activities, and they wanted to take July off. So like that can be something that might happen. Is there might be months where we meet once. There might be months we don't meet at all, and then there might be times when we deviate a little bit from the consistent like twice a month schedule, if that makes sense. So there is some flexibility for the group to decide based on how they want to work.
Great, thank you.
Which reminds me that the group will meet at a time the group decides on
Yes,
as well.
thank you.
And it'll mostly be virtual, in person in the beginning to get to know each other and for that healing and trust building, and then online.
And if the group decides that they want to meet more often in person, we can, that is a possibility, or, if they want to do every quarter just to have more interaction, that is also a possibility.
In the chat, if we could get to those before we take some other hands.
Sure. I haven't been looking at the chat. Who's the first
We
one?
have Valeria asking, are we going to have any kind of training during this time? So the first, I would say maybe 2 months. Margot, you can tell me if that's just, that's the accurate based on our most recent work. I'd say like the first 2 months plus the healing and trust building will largely about coming to a shared understanding of the context that we're operating in, including like what other coalitions and cities and counties and regions are doing to address equitable transit-oriented development, terminology, history, etc. So a significant portion of this will be training. And then from Francesca, we have, do we apply as individuals? If we're part of an organization, can there be one rotating representative per organization?
Julia, do you mind if I provide some clarification to Valeria's question as well? So once we get into the ETOD tactics and implementation, there also will be some training components. Like we will be bringing in people with, like if folks are interested in like, how does affordable housing get funded, or how do we fund certain kinds of community ownership models? We will be bringing people with that experience to talk about those things before we dive into it, so that you have the opportunity to learn the technical side in combination with like the community expertise. And then I can answer, Julia's okay if I answer Francesca's question? So you will be applying as individuals. If you belong to an organization, you can apply with the affiliation to an organization. And if you feel like you have your participation might be better supported, if there are times where you can't participate, then if you have the ability to have someone from your organization participate, I think we can accommodate for that. Margot or Julia, we also haven't, these are great questions.
Yeah.
We haven't specifically thought about rotating representation. Obviously, I think we'd want some level of strong commitment just because the rapport of relationships with the other community members.
Yeah, I think for consistency's sake, it's probably best to have it be one main individual, just since we'll be, building on this knowledge that we're gaining in the beginning by looking at different case studies, and then we'll be doing deeper dives and research onto different strategies. So I think that might get tricky if the lack of not, we're switching between people who are missing out on things. But the application does have a section where you can write an organization you're affiliated with, and has that reference letter of support, so you could put someone in the org you're tied to. So we definitely, want folks with these ties to communities, whether that's an organization or more informal. I'm just going to add on to the multiple people applying from one organization question, since that's related. Yes, as many people as you want can apply from one organization. We'll probably only accept one person from an organization, just since we have a limited amount of people. It's only 10 to 20, so probably more around 15 people total, and we want to make sure we're getting a broad range of folks from different communities, but feel free to have multiple folks apply. Thank you.
I know Damaris, you've been waiting for a while.
Thanks. So I've done a lot of community outreach work, and also like thinking about, I guess I have a couple different questions. One thing that's come up for me a lot is coming from a community of people who have been excluded from planning and development. We don't have a lot of experience with project development and management, and we really want to be able to own places and create community spaces and do affordable housing projects. So one question is, if part of the, I feel like I'm a little worried that your plan is not long enough, that there's a lot of technical assistance and capacity, like it's not capacity building in the way that the government tends to talk about capacity building as just giving an org a whole bunch of money. I'm looking for our community to be trained for how to work in these fields so that we can be the ones leading the projects, instead of having another, like a non, a mainstream architect and development team do all of, like, get all of this money and do all of this work. And then if we're not set up for success, I'm worried about us losing those projects. That if we end up failing, the development projects could end up being sold to, so I really want to make sure that I think I have a couple of questions. If the plan is for us to be able to come up with a way to get that training, get that experience, so that we can be our own community leaders and advocates and manage the projects. The other thing that I think is an issue is community building and getting, like, especially for the Native community, we have purposefully been scattered across Seattle. I don't know, it's too much history to go into why that was done, but there's also been a long time in the goal of assimilation to keep us apart from each other. So I really want our community to be able to collaborate and come together, and wondering if part of this program will support community building so that we can be stronger and work together. So that's a couple of my questions. And I also, it makes me a little nervous about if your timeline is too short for what we need.
Yeah.
I can answer the first question. And I think, where we hope to be at the end of this timeline isn't necessarily that the participants are like ready to break ground on a project, but more that we understand what it would take to support the participants to do that. And so I feel like you just named, one of our tactics and strategies, which is capacity building for community-based organizations to be able to implement this work. So I think that's kind of like the level of detail that we would end up with. We would say, like, that's a strategy. How do we do that? And at the same time, there might be other strategies that are like, let's hold on to the land so that once you're ready, like once you feel like you have what you need and you have the team that's reflective of your community and able to kind of lead on the values. So I don't know if that answers your first question in terms of the specificity. Our timeline is partially like dictated and tied to the timeline for the transit investments, which is always moving and changing, but also that we don't, 1.5 years is already a significant commitment. We didn't want to say, like, this is forever. You're going to hang out with us forever. Andrew, do you want to take the second question or comment?
Was the second one about timeline or
community building?
Yeah, I think what we really are hoping for in this process is, like, if you, and I'll answer this in combination with the timeline question. We do agree that by the end of the timeline, it's not going to, whatever the outcomes are, that is up to the group to decide. So, like, if there's strong recommendations of we need to build stronger community relationships, and because our communities have been historically scattered across the city and also excluded from each other and also government processes, that can be priorities in the plan. And obviously, I won't dictate what community building looks like in your community, but that is something that for folks who, if there are folks from the Indigenous community on our advisory group and they feel strongly about what that looks like, we would like that to be centered and prioritized in whatever the implementation plan would be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think just echoing, like, this is the very beginning of this, well, the beginning of this process going out. There's been a lot of trying to figure out how to do it internally. And yeah, it definitely don't view it as being able to accomplish everything in this timeline, but a starting point, and some really great strategies and suggestions that you had for how to do it.
Thank you. I think that it all makes sense, but I'm also,
Yeah.
even though I'm saying like I know it's going to take a while for
Right.
efforts to get started, I know that something that our community said is we've been asked for 20 years.
Yes.
What do you want to do? What do you want? And we already know, like we want to build places. Like we're kind of tired of being asked if we want to and what we want. Like we're ready to move forward. Well, in a way, we're emotionally ready to move forward. So I'm also like hoping that if I can apply and be involved, that we can advocate for something to get started, because
Yes.
I keep hearing over and over from our leadership, we are tired of being asked about what we want to do. Thank you.
Anyone?
Oh, so there's Slayman. Slayman, I know you've been patiently waiting.
Thank you. I just wanted to, wanted to confirm, and I think just looking at the timeline, looks like whatever strategy that's going to be implemented is going to be separate from the comp update, right? It's probably going to happen afterwards.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the comprehensive plan for the city of Seattle. I think right now, yeah, our timelines don't align. So thank you for pointing that out. But that, whatever strategies come out of this, there's already some early conversations that I've been part of around amendments to the comprehensive plan. And I think, you probably part of the conversations around the equitable development. I can't remember what the actual
Equitable
element
development
is
zoning.
called. I
Yeah.
know, like the companion plan.
Oh.
Sorry, none of us are on the comp plan team, but that a lot of this, right? A lot of the values and the vision that were co-developed in the last few years for this process, they align with and mirror the Equitable Development Initiative and the work that EDI has been able to do, and then and other ongoing efforts. So it's not, I don't think, to Demaris's point, like we're not reinventing the wheel with this process, but we're trying to bring everything together around this idea of light rail investments and high capacity transit investments. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
There's a question in the chat. Can you give an example of how the ETOD advisory group's implementation plans would be able to impact light rail expansion plans that have been put in place for 2037? I just want to clarify that we're not actually planning the transit itself. That is a separate sound transit thing. What we're talking about is development in the neighborhoods surrounding new light rail. So as we've seen in the past, and I think Rainier Beach is a great example of this, not great, bad example, but communities get a great new transit and then it ends up raising the property values, people get pushed out, and the same communities that didn't have access to these services continue to not have access because they can't afford to live there anymore. So it's, displaces folks, destroys that community in a way, and then they're left without even this great new thing. So we're not changing the transit itself, we're trying to change how that development happens. And a big part of that is getting community ownership of the land. So coming up with different strategies for how we can do that to safeguard those areas and create more affordable housing, but other things that might not just be housing, as we mentioned, like could be childcare, could be grocery stores, or a green space, a community gathering space. Does that clarify? Or anyone want to add to that?
Maybe just a couple of additions to that, Margot. Thank you. So, there's two, lots of questions coming in. There's, where am I going with this? I think for the strategy and implementation plan, it's high level. It's things that are going to apply citywide, but that can be implemented in a neighborhood context. So, for example, like the questions that we might be asking through this process is like, how do we fund community? How do we get enough money to fund community organizations to buy land or develop land that they already have in a community serving way? But it could also be like policy questions of like, what requirements might we want to impose on private development? Like currently we have mandatory housing affordability, which requires private developers to provide, include affordable housing in their developments or provide funding, an equivalent amount of funding to the city of Seattle to fund housing somewhere else. Do we enhance that in areas that are close to transit, or are there other, like, do we have requirements around what might go in the ground floor or things like that? So it's both high level, but with place-based, neighborhood implementation. And that's why we want to make sure we have representation from across the city, not just in places that are getting new transit, but places that have existing transit or transit that's coming online before the Sound Transit 3 timeline. And this is strategies, particularly, Damaris, for your question. This is strategies that's mostly not about publicly owned land. It will include publicly owned land, but it's about the rest of the neighborhood.
Slayman, do you have another question?
Yeah, I mean, it's just in line with what's being discussed as far as how it, being able to, I guess, not really affect, but maybe influence the transit development that's going on. I mean, I know you mentioned this high level. It's not really directly, identifying locations or anything like that. But I mean, would something like advising or recommendations that SDOT would be able to really consider regarding infrastructure that's already been placed, such as for example the light rail going to Martin Luther King. If something was to be suggested as far as putting raising it on a platform or making it more safer. I mean, is that something? Obviously, it's a lot of investment, but something that at least can be pushed forward, something like that, or is that it's out of scope of what we're trying to do?
To try, Andrew, do you want me to try?
Go for it.
I think to Margot's point earlier, we're not, the city of Seattle and especially the Office of Planning and Community Development, we're not Sound Transit, who really is the kind of leaders on the construction and the planning for the infrastructure, the light rail infrastructure itself. But I don't, right, like we have a question about access and like how do you access the transit and how do you access the things that are around the transit? I don't think it's out of our scope to say, an important factor for access to transit is being able to get there safely, which is like prioritizing elevated or underground or whatever it is, transit stations. So I don't think it's fully out of the scope of this, but I also that's like harder for us to, it's not something that the city of Seattle implements. But I think station location and construction is not something that we'll talk about, but access and like safe access to the transit is something that we would.
I think I can also add that Sound Transit and the city, they're currently undergoing a process for the current light rail investments that's part of West Seattle and Ballard Link extensions, including access. And I think where our work can actually influence in terms of access is the areas that would be beyond like the immediate 2 blocks and the station itself. So if there's access improvements and even how you define access that's beyond those areas, that is within the realm of what we can discuss and consider in this process. Betty, do you have a question?
Yeah, I've been working on and with Sound Transit planning about access. It is a huge issue, and I'm a co-founder of Transit Equity for All. I would be happy to meet with any of you or your groups to discuss or do a presentation on Sound Transit's latest plans for the Ballard Link extension, because it does impact throughout the region, but most heavily on people of color in the South End down to Tacoma. So I put my email address into the chat. You've raised some really good issues about access, and my colleagues in Transit Equity for All and I can update you on what's happening there. And I'm Betty Lau, a co-founder of Transit Equity for All.
Thank you, Betty. I'm doing a quick time check. We have about 5 minutes left. Are there any remaining questions? If not, I'll have Margot, can you give a quick just summary of next steps and any like suggestions or instructions on how to apply?
Yeah, I was going to put my email in the chat as well, if anybody has follow-up questions for later. If you go to our website, which the link is further up, I can drop it in again after I'm finished speaking, and you click on the Apply tab, that it'll have some instructions, and you can kind of look at the application guide to get the overview, and then you'll actually apply through Submittable. There's a link there on the website. It'll take you to that website. And then I think you have to create an account if you don't already have one, and then answer the questions. You do need that reference letter of support, which is also due October 15th. You can submit your application before your reference submits theirs, but just keep track of that, make sure that they get it in order for your application to be complete. And yeah, it's due 11:59 p.m. on October 15th, so right before midnight. Yeah.
Thank you, Margot. Alrighty. If there are no other questions, we want to extend all of our gratitude for your time. This is really exciting work for us, and we hope that you all decide to apply or help us spread the word. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great night.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.